Taking a deep breath in. And here we are. Welcome, YouTube family. Let's go ahead and reground ourselves. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Trying out a new angle today. Let me know in the comments below if there's still a lot of the blur that goes on, because I know when it's extra close to us, sometimes the blur comes in and out as it's trying to fixate if ever I move too much. So on that note, let's go ahead and do a quick recap. This is the third week. We've already gone over 2 weeks of this, and we have 1 or 2 more weeks ahead of us. But we've been really talking about the Living Peace Code in my book, Living Peace. It's really the essence of what the center, the community, is built upon. 9 tenets, 9 teachings, practices that help us cultivate inner peace. And so the little paragraph I've been starting with each week is, in Dunisha, the Living Peace Code is our anchor for clarity, presence, and peace. No matter what circumstances arise in our life, we can always return to the code to receive its stabilizing influence. Dunisha is a spirituality we live and teach, while Living Peace is the philosophy. And so my book, Living Peace, is the philosophy of Dunisha, and then my next book that's coming out next year, Living Earth, is the spirituality of Dunisha. And then there's going to be Living Joy, which is the psychology of Dunisha. And then after that, there'll be one more book called, most likely, Living Magic, which will be the mysticism of Dunisha. And I haven't even taught that here in Colorado yet. Just you wait. It's really exciting. And so on that note, let's take another deep breath. So last week we covered ignorance is an illusion, we seek understanding, followed by chaos is an illusion, we seek harmony. And the week before that, we covered mastery of thought, mastery of impulse, mastery of emotion. Today, we're covering tenet 6, which is duality is an illusion, we seek transcendence. And the reason why I'm just spending the whole talk on this is because duality is one of the greatest points of living peace in Dunisha, and it's also sometimes the hardest one to really grasp, because it challenges us everything we've ever been taught. Politically, religiously, culturally, we've definitely as a species cultivated a society, at least here in America, where there's a lot of duality. And what duality is it's morality. Think of it like that. Duality is morality. It's the rights, the wrongs, the goods, the bads. In Dunisha and Living Peace, I separate it to really help us understand it. There's polarity, which is day, night, hot, cold, birth, death. And then there's duality, which is the human made. On this side, polarity, it's inherent in all things. But in duality, it's perception, it's opinion. It's a human-based concept, which we are sizing things up for their worth and their value. And that is quite dangerous to us. In some instances, certainly, we may have grown into our society based off of this, saying, don't do that, that's bad for you, or that's wrong, and it helped cultivate legal systems and all this jazz. But at the same time, we can live our life using polarity and not duality, because we can definitely still say, don't do that, that will cause harm. Versus, if you do that, you're an awful, terrible person. See the difference there? Our moral compass in Dunisha is less about right, wrong, good, bad, and more about peace, pain, harm, healing. See the difference there? And when you take it more from an angle of peace, pain, harm, healing, you're speaking factually about things versus constantly sizing situations, people, things, their worth and their value. Which, has anyone been on your own healing journey? And when you feel guilt and shame, does that help your healing journey? No. But often, where does guilt and shame arise from? Outside expectations that then turn into internalized belief systems that we feel less than or greater than ourselves and other people and situations. And depending on how the tides are flowing, we might be feeling great, and other times we might be feeling awful. So it's this constant conditional way of interacting with the world, and we have amazing highs and lows. And so this teaching, duality is an illusion, we seek transcendence, helps us transcend it. And the meaning of transcend is simply rise above. I do like the example of Jesus walking on water, because that's an example of transcendence. You know, a lot of his miracles were not so much about the surface level meaning of the miracles, like walking on water, whoop-de-fucking-do. It's not going to help save humanity. But the teaching behind that his ability to walk on water was teaching that here's this individual who achieved some semblance of enlightenment, some connection, and he's now able to rise above the stuff most of humanity drowns in. You see the metaphor there? He's able to walk above, rise above, walk on top of the stuff that we drown in, fight and develop conflicts and kill each other over. That's the elevation of consciousness that example teaches, not the actual miracle. Does that make sense? And so that's when we really understand the idea of transcending opposites, reconciling opposites. You're going to notice a lot more inner peace start to take up root in your being. So let's go ahead and, now that that's out of the way, let's break it down. So as our new tradition, you get to fill in blanks. And so in every tenet, I have two arts associated with the tenet, aka teaching. The first art is the art of soothed morality. And these are both different than what some of my older book taught. I've been slightly adjusting some of the arts over the years to make them a bit more bring it home, if you will. I've been seeing where some things fall short, and so that's why you're going to notice the arts have evolved, but they often still carry the same meaning of the previous ones. So the art of soothed morality. Let's sit with that for a moment. Let's breathe that in. Soothed morality is another way of saying soften your morality. It's gonna curse there, but it's okay. I already got my F word in for the sermon. Soothed morality, softening our moral judgments, our moral opinions. When you look at something or someone and you say, oh, they're bad. Oh, that's wrong. They're evil. Can't stand them. I hate them. Doesn't feel good, does it? Can you feel when you have that perception, it actually twists up your insides? And maybe you haven't really reflected on that before, but take some time next time you feel that like loathing kick in and you're judging someone or something, or it makes you sick because you see some violence going on in the world. Check in with your body, see what's going on. More often than not, you're gonna, again, I can't, that is so awful, it makes me sick. That is so violent, it makes me sick. They're such a bad person, it makes me sick. See how we use language? It does influence our body, but we're not thinking that it influences our body. So in Dunisha and Living Peace, we learn to soothe this morality complex that we have. Because we recognize that when we're in judgment of another person, place, situation, whatever, it actually makes us lose our own balance. It makes us lose our own peace. And so as a therapist, I know this firsthand. I have to, because I have worked with people from all walks of life, not only the abused, but also the abusers. And I've worked with people that some other people would never talk to or work with if they ever found out what they did to someone. But is it my job to judge them? No. Is it my job to be a space holder so that they can find their own way to healing? Absolutely. And so we like to think where judgment and labeling things right, wrong, good, bad, that it somehow helps our society. Maybe it did at one point. I'm not going to discredit that. But we're now starting to evolve beyond that. In my book, I talk about the Homo luminous spiritual evolution. We're evolving from Homo sapiens to Homo luminous beings, where we're this next 100,000, I don't know how long, 100 years, 1,000 years, we'll see. But we're definitely learning to recognize ego more than ever before. And we're going to slowly start to create a society based less on egoic notions, and more based on harmonizing influences. Here in America, we definitely can see how the prison system's working, right? Is it working really well for us? No. And that's a very egotistical approach on trying to fix people who are broken, when really it's not about helping them. It's about removing things that are uncomfortable, removing things that make us uncomfortable from our attention so we don't have to see them, but we're not actually taking the time to understand the pain and reconcile it. And that comes from a dualistic perspective. There's good people, there's bad people, there's right way, there's wrong ways. And as long as we keep creating society based off of that, at some point you'll most likely be considered in the wrong and in the bad, even if it's purely biased and perception based, and you're going to be an outcast from it, and it's going to cause great separation and harm. Some of you may have already felt that way before. Who's experienced pain, who's experienced loss, who's experienced separation, who's experienced amazing judgment. And maybe it's not even things that are that big of a deal. Do you remember back in the day when tattoos were of the devil? Who has a tattoo in this room? Most of you. But back in the day, that was a big thing. You had one foot in hell already. And to some, it still is. But that's the idea, where it's very important for us to really recognize our morality, and to soothe it on not only soft things like tattoos, but also when people are actually causing violence, and understanding where that violence is stemming from, rather than just dismissing it and saying it's evil, it's bad, it's wrong. In Dunisha Living Peace, we really take the time to understand its root so that we can then heal it. And the biggest thing here in our teachings is that we always say peace starts within the home. Guess what? When you have parents who don't understand, when you have a community, when you have religions and political groups that then raise families within it that don't understand the nature of non-duality, of transcending duality, and they teach these ideas of severe extremes of right, wrong, good, bad, doesn't that lead to further violence on our planet? Doesn't it lead to further nationalism that can also turn into violence? Doesn't it lead to racism and prejudice? And so that's why it's really important for us to take a step back, because a lot of times the first things that we judge as right, wrong, good, bad are the things we don't understand. And we push them away. And then it turns into belief systems, and then eventually it turns into behaviors. And then eventually turns into political ideologies, religious ideologies that then influence laws and create borders and countries and all these things that then can severely rip away our ability for humanitarian effort. And then it causes us to justify things where we're judging other people as wrong and bad, but at the same time, we might be the ones actually inflicting the most harm. Interesting, isn't it? Has anyone ever said they loved you, but then they harmed you in the next sentence? Exhibit A. It happens all the time in personal relationships, where we'll say we love someone or something, but then we actually harm it. We harm someone with our words. We harm someone with our actions. Art of rhythmic polarity is the second one. And for those of you like me who struggled a long time with spelling rhythm and rhythmic, it's RHYTHMIC. Rhythmic polarity. So we've already kind of broken down how duality is morality. And then there's this polarity that is just inherent in nature. It's really important to recognize that, because we're not dismissing polarity. We're not dismissing that there's peace, pain, that there's harm, healing, that there's the light of the day, the dark of the night, the ebb, the flow of the moon, the ebb, the flow of the tides, our emotions. It's a rhythm. It's like, I also explain it as a pendulum. It's always ebbing and flowing. Just as nations rise, they eventually collapse. Just as someone is born and grows, they eventually age and pass. And so it really is the Taoist symbol of the yin-yang, where you have one side white, one side black, but then in the white side there's a black dot, and the white side, in the black side there's a white dot. And so that is one of the most perfect symbols for polarity that is inherent in everyday life and every single moment, even down to our atoms that have negative and positive charges. Interesting, isn't it? So you have that polarized essence in all living things, everything. So let's breathe that in. So it's important to understand the rhythmic polarity because it can help us soothe our morality so that we can then seek to transcend the ignorance, the illusory nature of human-made duality. It's a very big sentence. Holy damn. So I guess breaking it down into more simple terms, we recognize and honor the polarity, and we seek to understand and rise above the morality and the duality. We reconcile the opposites within ourselves. Polarity also says, and we can take this into duality as well, hate and love are on the same spectrum. Ignorance and knowledge are on the same spectrum. Negative, positive, same spectrum. So even in our judgments, there is still a spectrum, and that they're all just varying degrees of the same thing. It's very hard to hate. Normally, in most instances where hate is arisen, it comes out of from something or someone you actually loved, or the loss of a loved one. A lot of times you hear people just hating random groups of people. It's actually not hate at all, it's ignorance. They may have never even met someone of the group that they are judging. And then the moment they meet someone that they're judging, their hate actually changes. I'm living proof of that, you know? And so I've first time people meet me, they're their first gay person. Interesting thing is their perception of hate changes, because now they actually, there's a tangibility to it, and it was never hate to begin with. It was just pure ignorance. They never actually understood or met someone that was different in that way. And so really think about that. All of your judgments, think about it. Low self-esteem, high self-esteem. There's judgments all in between. Low self-worth, high self-worth, self-loathing, self-love. And so it's all on a singular spectrum. And it's very important to recognize that it's our job to not only understand this, but eventually transcend this. I always tell folks, the way for self-love and all that to exist, it's not more narcissism. Because a lot of times, you know, this whole self-help movement, it's like you really want to love yourself and you want to get fully self-empowered. But the issue is you're still in that damn spectrum. You know, you just switched coins from one side being low self-esteem and now you're at high self-esteem. But guess what happens when maybe you got that job or you got that partner, you got whatever, but then that gets jeopardized. And the self-esteem was actually based more on external situations. You're going to go back and you're going to have that pendulum swing. Our job is to neutralize it, like we talked about last week. One of the arts for chaos is an illusion, we seek harmony, is the art of neutrality. When a Zen master looks in the mirror, you think he's going to have an inflated sense of self? I just love myself today. No, he doesn't view it in that way, or she doesn't view it in that way. It's neutral. And so the way to rise above this constant yo-yo swing of extremes, high, low, we seek to completely step outside of it altogether and recognize its true nature, which the true nature is that everything is impermanent. And so do we really need to have such a strong, and this is tenet 9, such a severe, extreme sense of self, to where how we feel is always subjective to our surroundings and the thoughts in our head? Or can we fully come to a place of neutralizing it and coming into inner peace? This is some deep shit. I'm sorry. Hopefully it's landing. But this is where the teachings really skyrocket with this idea of duality, polarity, morality, all those things in between. And that's why many of our students, they've been freaking students for almost 10 years. And they're still working on it, because this is a lifestyle that we practice every single day to cultivate inner peace. And we recognize that a lot of our inner peace gets goofed up because of our perceptions, especially our dualistic perceptions, to where we're sizing things up and we're adding worth and we're adding value rather than taking a step back. And again, it goes back to what I said last week and the week before. Quote, do I need to have an opinion about this? Most of the time, no, you don't. So let's go ahead and just keep moving on. So the check-in for this week is, what is causing my pendulum to swing? What is causing my pendulum to swing? And when I say pendulum, think of it as like your emotional pendulum. You don't have to write this down, but you can shorthand it if you want. It can be, I often like to ask myself, is it my thoughts in this moment that's making my pendulum swing? Is it my behaviors? Is it my emotional attachments in this moment? It's really important to find the root of what is making this back and forth motion, this high, the low, the rocking. And again, there's nothing wrong with having highs and lows, but the reason why I teach to go beyond it is because rarely is it super peaceful. I mean, a hot damn, my example is I was the smolder. Dating, I was really big into dating, and so anytime I would meet someone, I'd feel that euphoric rush, and then you start to develop ideas around it, and then you have the high, but then guess what happens eventually? The crash happens. And so that was so much of my adolescence, and that was my kryptonite. Whenever I would start dating, and then I would develop ideas about it, and then I'd crash about it. And I think most people go through that. And think back to it. If you haven't experienced that in a while, think back to those times with romance, with affection, with receiving love or holding hands for the first time or kissing. And then you develop this idea, and then it turns into an extreme. And then when that expectation is not met, or maybe you walked into it with an expectation that was awful and that wasn't met, there's the crash. And so it's so important to recognize, are my thoughts around this? Is it my behaviors around this? Is it my emotional attachment around this that's causing this constant ebb and flow of emotions? And maybe dating's not something that many of you are going through right now. Just look at family then. We all have expectations on family. And when those expectations are not met, do you suffer? And so that's an opportunity to soothe morality, because a lot of times, who's ever said they shouldn't have done that? That's not right. They should know better. That's not respectful. Can't believe they said that. So those are just some stories I've heard people say over the years, including myself. And you're moralizing it. You're moralizing someone else's behavior when a lot of times their behavior is actually from ignorance, and they're not trying to spite you. Or it's a spilling over of their own pain and their own ideologies of what they think is right and wrong, and it causes harm. Again, ignorance is an illusion. We seek understanding. Don't fall in the trap of being ignorant and just blatantly labeling things and people. Instead, take the time to root it out and to understand. And so the first practice, or actually the first practice is reduce extremes in my behavior. Reduce extremes in my behavior. For me, this was binge eating. That was one of my big things, especially, just tell my parents this here in the room. When I started living alone, I would not eat all day, and then I would get especially when I was stressed, I'd get just like a shitload of fast food at night, and then that's what I would eat. That was my main meal of the day. It didn't happen all the time, but that was definitely a big thing. I would often go out and dance, and then afterwards I'd stop by, someplace and then just load up. And it was amazing. But then I felt awful. And then it definitely did not help my health. And so over time, I started adopting more of a monk-like eating habit, where their idea of eating is, quote, just enough. You're eating for nutrition, not pleasure. And so there I'd be with just some rice and split pea soup on top. Among other fun things too. But yeah, I definitely did this whole year swap of eating a monk-like diet, not as severe, but viewing it just enough, taking the pleasure out of eating and simply viewing it as a beautiful source of nutrition that is keeping this body healthy. And so you see how I was removing the extreme there. But then I also had to remove the extremes of my thoughts and how I was judging situations. Not only was I removing extremes in my behavior, such as eating habits, but removing extremes in my perceptions of the world. How can I soften this right now? How can I soften my vocabulary? How can I soften my awareness? How can I soften this judgment? So let's read that in. Buddha actually really coined all of this, because before he reached enlightenment, he tried severe asceticism, which was very common in the East at that time, especially in India. And what's interesting is severe asceticism was like, just don't eat, starve yourself, hold in your breath for extreme amounts of times. And the more you kind of like push yourself through the pain of this physical existence, your mind can pierce the veil of illusion into enlightenment. And so he did the whole thing where it's just like, I'm just going to have a grain of rice a day, kind of like The Devil Wears Prada, for those who've seen that movie. I'm just going to eat a cheese cube anytime I'm about to faint. No one saw it? Okay.
Emily Blunt.
Emily Blunt, we love her. I don't think she's ever been compared to Buddha before. I think she'd like that. But yeah, literally, he supposedly he practiced, just eating 1 grain of rice per day. But then he goes on to stories about how just the immense pain and how he wasn't able to do anything for himself after a while. He's just like, this is not working. All these people that are practicing severe, extreme asceticism, they're not actually reaching enlightenment. So then he found the middle path, quote, just enough, moderation. And so when we go so far in extreme ways, even if it's supposed to help us, even if it's, quote, good things, we still become very zealous. We still become dogmatic about things. Who's met a vegan before that's annoying? Right? And so I'm a vegetarian, and I'm very big on environmental and animal cruelty reasons and all that stuff, and even just spiritually. But I never go out of my way to make someone feel awful about their life choices. And a lot of times people, especially, and this is a huge generalization, I apologize for those of you that may be vegan and you don't do this, but there is a thing out there. PETA really pushed that agenda to where it's to shock and to awe and to make people feel really bad about themselves and to motivate through guilt. And that's an extremist view that actually pushes and turns a lot of people off. Trying to motivate through guilt may be a great control manipulation tool for some, but it's still harmful. And so that's why we definitely approach things from the moderation, the middle path. Does that make sense? Pretty powerful, huh? And so one more thing, the other practice is to soften and change my spoken vocabulary. Soften and change my spoken vocabulary. I write about this in Living Peace as well. Find new ways of explaining things. One I love to remove is stop saying toxic. Who uses the word toxic? That's there's been a lot, I see it always online. People are like, I'm just removing toxic people from my life. Or just, the toxic news or the toxic that. And it's just, we don't recognize that when we even just invoke that word, we're then becoming it. We're becoming the source of separation. So rather than trying to remove yourself from all the toxic negativity, dark forces of the world, simply look to understand it. Simply look to have compassion. Simply look to soften that vocabulary. Does that make sense? And so, for example, I've tried to never say I hate or I don't like. Instead, I use that's not my preference. See how I softened that? Same thing, I never use the words, or I do my best to never use the words bad or wrong. Like with Angel, our dog, we've never once called her a bad girl. Instead, now we don't say this to her either because it's a long sentence, won't make sense, but that is not benefiting behavior. But you're speaking factually. She's not bad. She's not a bad dog. She's not wrong in being a dog. You know, we're trying to personalize our own ideas of what she should be based off of a human agenda. But instead, we can recognize, is this harmful behavior or is this benefiting behavior? And so when you start to look at things more factually and you take the time to explain it, it actually does soften vocabulary. The reason why we say bad, wrong is just because we're lazy. It's easier to just say that, those two words, versus spend a whole time coming up with a sentence to then explain something. And then that last, I already talked about it, but toxic and negative, I try not to use those words. Because really what, if someone is in negativity or toxicity, vibrationally, what's happening is they're spilling over their pain onto you. And that's not something to judge. It's something to have compassion for and take time to understand. When someone is spilling their pain in a toxic manner, they're not bad, they're not wrong. That's a calling, that's a cry for help. But nope, we just lock them away. And then we wonder why we have this underbelly here in America where we just are not confronting pain. We're not confronting abuse. We're not confronting the core wounds still of what this country was built upon on many layers, modern and ancient. And so we are known to just push away what we deem as ugly, what we deem as uncomfortable, what we deem as not worthy of our attention. And unfortunately, that creates an extreme that eventually that pendulum swings back, and then you have great harm because of it. So let's now fill in the blank, a Mad Lib down here. No. So we're looking for a, no. So activating extremes. Activating extremes keeps the pendulum in constant swing. Also, we cannot deny any one side, comma. Also, we cannot deny any one side, as that too creates an extreme. We must acknowledge all polarities and their Taoist-like dance to bring harmony. Acknowledge all polarities and their Taoist-like dance to bring harmony. And the other thing I forgot to have you write down, under examples, take a step back from using blank. That word is extremes. Activating extremes keeps the pendulum in constant swing. Also, we cannot deny any one side, as that too creates an extreme. Releasing all polarities and their Taoist-like dance. Acknowledge all polarities and their Taoist-like dance to bring harmony. So our big takeaway from today's topic is to start looking at the extremes in your life. Not only your thoughts and judgments, but also how you're behaving and interacting with the world, and also what you're allowing to flourish and take root in your heart emotionally. If you're an extremely emotional person, take a look at what those extremes are and where they stem from on a belief system. I'm still emotional, obviously, but I used to be extremely emotional. I probably could have been even considered a highly sensitive person. My parents were like, yes, God, it's true. And the reason why I don't suppress that anymore, but I've learned to neutralize it by understanding the true nature of reality, the true nature of impermanence, and recognizing how our thoughts turn into belief systems, and that's those belief systems develop expectations on how we should feel in different moments. And there's been a lot of science and psychology coming out about that, to where a lot of our emotions actually stem from predetermined ideas, thought expectations, belief systems. I've been teaching this for 10 years, and only, what was it, last year, where I finally saw this awesome TED Talks about it, where she's just like, we studied emotion and we realized it stems from thought. People challenge me on that all the time, but I'm like, if you really take the time to feel the emotion, lead into it, rather than just plow through it or get consumed by it, again, walking on water, walk on the stuff we drown in, you're going to notice that there's a story attached to it. And you're going to notice anytime you've ever broke through and felt better about something, if you take the time to really pay attention, the reason why you felt better about it, maybe a week later, a month later, a year later, 10 years later, you finally started telling a different story. And that new idea is what created the relief. It's the stages of grief. You finally came to acceptance. And when you came to acceptance, the fact of the matter still occurred, whether it was abuse, a loss, whatever, but your awareness, your perception of it started to shift. And that's where the feeling of peace came. Isn't that cool? So let's breathe that in. Well, I hope you enjoyed this talk today. I mean, it was definitely a bigger one. I always try to explain it a bit differently because I've probably given like 20 Sunday talks on duality before, and this one's definitely different than the ones I've ever given before. But maybe there's some takeaway from this in a different way, especially for those who may have heard it before. But next week, this caps us off. So we had the 3 masteries. This was the final third of the 3 illusions. And now next week, we're going to go into the 3 releasements. Releasing attachment to the mundane world, releasing attachment to what we think we know, releasing attachment to who we think we are. And I'll break all those down. And that will be quite delicious. And for those of you at home watching, if you only saw this one, you can actually go back and click under videos on the YouTube channel to see the other 2. Don't forget to subscribe. And so, as always, there are links down below if anyone would care to donate. It definitely helps us out. And as always, we hope you have a beautiful week, and we'll see you next time.